Muslims would say, is that actually it's the twisting of the Islam ideology by extremists that is the problem. It's not a genuine interpretation of Islam, because the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful. So they say,
that's
look,
not true.
Well, is it not true?
No, it isn't.
If that wasn't true,
so
then if that wasn't true, then wouldn't de facto most Muslims commit acts of terrorism?
Most their texts. But does Islam contain endless quotes, endless edicts that are profoundly problematic to the kuffar?
Piers Morgan loves playing the reasonable centrist on TV. But the moment Gad Saad starts asking real questions about Islam, you can almost hear the panic set in. What was supposed to be Piers lecturing everyone about Islamophobia quickly turned into one of the most awkward takedowns I've seen in a long time. Honestly, the British commentator used to be everyone's favourite, until this happened on live TV.
Start just by what Mehdi Hassan told me about Islamophobia, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you're kind of the view it doesn't really exist, and that you shouldn't be silenced from criticising Islam by people shouting you're Islamophobic. Now, Mehdi Hassan, and I sort of subscribe to this as well, I think if you launch the kind of ferocious, relentless attacks that someone like Tommy Robinson has done on Islam and Muslims in the way that he's done so many times, it's eventually pretty painfully obvious to people that you're coming at this from a bigoted position. And therefore, by the dictionary definition of Islamophobia, if it comes from a place of hate, that actually is Islamophobia, isn't it?
Piers tried to frame criticism of Islam as bigoted by lumping Tommy Robinson in with actual hate. He suggested that strong repeated attacks on Islamic ideology cross into Islamophobia because they come from a place of hate. This is the classic trap so many mainstream voices fall into. They treat Islam like a race or an ethnicity instead of a set of ideas open to scrutiny. But thankfully, Gad Saad immediately cut through that nonsense.
Thank you so much for having me back, Piers. The devil is in the details, right? So if I were to say that Jews are inherently diseased, they are degenerates, they are evil, they're parasites, that would be anti-Semitic. If I say there are teachings in the Torah that are abhorrent given today's moral codes, that wouldn't be anti-Semitic. So if you were to make dispositional statements about individual Muslims, that would be Muslim bigotry. But if you say anything you want about the codified content of Islam, then by definition, that cannot be Islamophobic.
Okay, so let me play you a little mashup of examples, I would say, where Tommy Robinson has displayed Islamophobia by the criteria in the dictionary. Let's take a look.
We will unify every community against the hostility and barbarianism of Islam. I'm not racist, I despise racism. Islam is not a race, Islam is a fascist, violent ideology which masquerades as a religion.
Every single Muslim watching this video on YouTube, on 7/7, you got away with killing and maiming British citizens.
But we embrace migrants that come to this country and love it. The problem is Islamic migrants come to this country and declare war on it.
Now, when you hear all that, and in particular, it felt to me that what he said about 7/7, which was a bunch of extremist terrorists who happened to be Muslim committing terrorism, when you basically, at a crowd with a loud hailer in your mouth, embrace every single Muslim in the country and say you're all to blame for killing and maiming Brits, that is Islamophobic, isn't it? I mean, it has to be. Otherwise,
so
what is?
Criticizing the content of Islamic texts and teachings isn't bigotry, any more than criticizing problematic parts of the Bible or Torah is anti-Christian or anti-Jewish. Piers' attempt to shield Islam from the same standards applied to every other ideology is weak from the start.
Address this in using two examples. The number one predictor of child abuse is if there is a step-parent in the house. It is 100 times greater predictor than all other predictors. And yet, most step-parents are perfectly lovely and kind and don't commit abuse. So understanding statistical reasoning and causal inferencing is important. So let me give a second example. Since 9/11 alone, there have been 46,000 plus terror attacks committed in roughly 70 countries by Islamic terrorists. That is an absolute fact, notwithstanding the fact that out of 2 billion Muslims, most did not commit terrorist acts. So we can point to 7/7 and say that that was driven by Islamic ideology, while also speaking from the other side of our mouths that most Muslims that we'll ever meet are peaceful. Both of those two statements are true.
Gad brought receipts. Since September 11th, there have been over 46,000 terrorist attacks carried out in the name of Islam across dozens of countries. That's not ancient history or fringe extremism. It's a repeated pattern tied to specific teachings. Piers tried the usual whataboutism. The IRA, American mass shootings by white men. It's the same tired deflection every time. The difference is obvious. IRA terrorism wasn't rooted in Catholic doctrine, the way jihadist violence is rooted in Islamic texts. Pretending otherwise is intellectual dishonesty. Notice how Piers looks increasingly uncomfortable as Gad refuses to let him dodge with emotional appeals.
All Muslims would say is that actually it's the twisting of the Islam ideology by extremists that is the problem. It's not a genuine interpretation of Islam, because the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful. So they say,
that's
look,
not true.
Well, is it not true?
No, it isn't.
If that wasn't true,
so
then if that wasn't true, then wouldn't de facto most Muslims commit acts of terrorism?
Most Jews eat prosciutto and also eat shrimps, but they're not practicing a more gentle form of kosher law. They simply ignore the fact that kosher laws dictate that you don't eat shrimps and that you don't eat prosciutto, right? I eat prosciutto. I'm Jewish. I'm not practicing a more peaceful version of Judaism. I just ignore that which I don't wish to apply. Most Muslims don't commit those acts because they are kind and decent people who choose to ignore whichever they don't wish to follow in their texts. But does Islam contain endless quotes, endless edicts that are profoundly problematic to the kuffar? The answer is a resounding yes.
Does the Bible do that?
Yeah, of course the Bible does that.
Right.
But
so the same.
as far as
you're saying you would have the same view of Christianity, for example, would you?
Right. Well, if Christians were going around right now quoting passages from the New Testament and committing 46,000 plus terror attacks in nearly 70 countries since 9/11 alone, then I would say we need to worry about those texts. If they were Talmudic extremists doing that, then we would worry about that. Look, Deuteronomy has a lot of nasty things. Find the Elamites and kill them. But I don't know many guys called Mordechai Rubinstein looking for Amalekites to kill them. So, common sense matters, right? Most Muslims are lovely. I know more Muslims than most people will ever meet in their lives. None of them have ever been terrorists. This doesn't take away from the fact that there is an astounding problem with Islamic terrorism. Both those statements are true.
It is, but
This part has me laughing and shaking my head at the same time. Piers keeps pushing the line that most Muslims are peaceful, as if that magically erases the doctrinal problems. Most Muslims are decent people who ignore the worst parts of the texts, but that doesn't make the texts themselves benign. Take the Rotherham grooming scandal, for instance, where 1,400 girls were abused while authorities looked away to avoid racism accusations, is a perfect example of how this mindset harms real people. Piers' refusal to confront the cultural and religious patterns behind these scandals feels like willful blindness. He wants to sound compassionate and politically correct, but it comes across as naive at best and dishonest at worst.
give you two parallels, very different things. One, as somebody put to me on X today, during the years when the IRA were committing appalling acts of terrorism, it would be like saying, well, then all, according to Tommy Robinson, his logic would say all Irish people are to blame for the maiming and killing, right? Which clearly would have been an outrageous thing to say. Secondly, and I raised this with someone the other day on the show who was incensed that I would even draw this parallel, but I said, why not? If you look at the number of mass shootings in America in the last 30 years, they're almost exclusively perpetrated by deranged young white men. So does that mean that we should, by the same logic, say, well, there's all these terrible mass shootings going on, they're all being committed by the same type of profile of person, therefore all young white men in America have to be treated with deep suspicion, which is what Tommy Robinson that's where his logic takes you. That's why I have a problem with the Tommy Robinsons of this world. It's not his message and banging the drum about the rape gang scandal. He's been absolutely right about that. It's just he's such a flawed messenger for all sorts of other reasons. And the reason that's problematic is because he gets used by people who are trying to avoid accountability, because they say, well, look at this guy, the one who's shouting loudest about us. Look at him. He's a convicted football thug. He beats up policemen and gets convicted for it. He's a mortgage fraudster. He's a passport faker. He's committed contempt of court 3 times. He's nearly wrecked trials involving the rape gang scandals. He's made a Syrian refugee boy's life utter hell with his lies. That's why he's now in prison, and so on. In other words, by demonizing the messenger, those who should be held to account are able to hide behind Tommy Robinson being the flag bearer for all this. I think that is a problem.
Piers insists on repeating talking points and defending his own inconsistency. The contrast between him and Gad is brutal. Piers leans on labels, selective outrage, and moral posturing. Gad uses logic, statistics, and clear distinctions. This points to a bigger problem in mainstream media. The fear of being called Islamophobic often leads to soft-peddling serious issues, like integration failures, grooming gangs, terror statistics, and parallel societies.
Robinson has some issues in his past. I don't know all of them, although I've had a chance to have long conversations with him. He's even come to visit me in Montreal. He never, in my presence, said anything that struck me as bigoted or racist. So I'm not here to defend Tommy Robinson. Christopher Hitchens, whom I'm sure you know well, he's a compatriot British. Excuse me?
I employed him when I was editor of the Daily Mirror. And you know when I employed him? I know what you're about to say to me about what he said about Islamophobia. Before you say it, and you're right to say it, I would point out I hired him during the Iraq War because he supported that war, and the paper opposed it before, during, and after. And I thought it was important to have a voice in the paper up against John Pilger, actually, quite often, who was obviously viscerally against the war. But I let Hitchens run riot, even though I thought he was completely wrong, and even though I look back on it now and I'm convinced he was completely wrong. So Hitchens wasn't always right, before you say to me what he said about Islamophobia, which you're about to do.
Well, I mean, yes, I could make the point about what he said about Islamophobia, but the point that I was going to make is that Christopher Hitchens is, and I think you'll probably agree with this, one of the most eloquent speakers that we will have ever seen,
yes.
Right? He has a beautiful British accent. He speaks with a beautiful vocabulary, as does Douglas Murray. So they may say things that are, in terms of their content, absolutely indistinguishable from anything that Tommy Robinson says. But Tommy Robinson's style, his accent, is one that serves as an aesthetic injury to the people who carry the progressive lisp. And therefore, people react to Tommy Robinson because of his style of delivery. Elon Musk, who, as you know, is a good friend of mine, has a direct way of speaking that is not as eloquent as Christopher Hitchens. That doesn't in any way imply that what he is saying is not veridical. So we have to differentiate between the substance and the content.
I don't disagree.
Tommy Robinson.
If you've followed this debate for years, you'll notice that Piers often plays both sides. He'll criticize specific incidents, but then rush to defend the broader ideology when someone like Gad Saad, Tommy Robinson, or Konstantin Kissin brings uncomfortable data. And speaking of Tommy Robinson, ever since the lad called him a fool, and rightly so for so many reasons, he's found every opportunity to blacklist him, such as this.
About Donald Trump, same thing. The rhetoric often bears little relation to what he actually does. I also think it's important to focus on what people actually do. My problem with Elon, who I think is a complete genius, my problem over this week has been the way he's targeted Jess Phillips, a female MP, in my view, wrongly and inaccurately, but that's neither here nor there. By calling her a genocidal rape apologist, he's put a massive target on her head, where people have now been arrested for threatening her life. And we've had 2 members of parliament, including a young woman, who've been murdered in the last 10 years in this country. I just think that kind of language crosses a line. I mean, would you agree?
Look, I hear you. I get that. I've been accused of being the orchestrator of the killing of Gazan children. I sit as a professor who's 60 years old in Montreal doing evolutionary psychology research. I have nothing to do with the killing of anyone in Gaza, yet I am the baby genocidal killer. So, of course, I empathize with the point that you're making. And that's why I said that sometimes Elon might be very blunt in the way he says what he says, but the content of what he's saying, the ire that he has, really is coming from a good place, right? Britain does suffer from an orgiastic form of suicidal empathy, the topic of my forthcoming book, because they're much more desirous of protecting the sensibilities of their Muslim population than to worry about the integrity of the bodily and the integrity of children. That's not a good calculus to have. I think that's what triggered the ire of Elon. The fact that he went after this person is regrettable. I share your concern there. But again, I think the fact that you and I and others are having these important conversations, only good things can come from it.
No, I completely agree.
The selective approach he fosters does no one any favours, least of all the many peaceful Muslims who do want reform. The constant shielding of Islamic doctrine from scrutiny, while every other belief system gets torn apart, isn't tolerance. It's cowardice dressed up as sophistication.
Mehdi first, you now, having Matthew here who has his views about it. I mean, it's interesting what you just said. It's not a million miles away from what Matthew said about the woke ideology getting a grip of our country in a way that so many people in officialdom felt incapable or too terrified to do the right thing because they were fearful of retribution and being accused of, being anti-Muslim or whatever it may be. And I completely get that. That's why, I was interested in what you were saying to me, and you said it on the Will Kane show. I love Will. I listened to that interview. It just slightly misinterpreted me. I'm not saying that any criticism of Muslims or Islam is wrong or unacceptable by any means. I think every group of people, whoever they are, I'm a Catholic. The Catholic Church sex scandal, abuse scandal was utterly horrific. It's just one of the most unspeakable things imaginable, that people purporting to be priests were out there abusing children for decades, and it is still going on, I'm sure. And I, as a Catholic, feel totally ashamed about the total lack of accountability, the cover-ups that went on, and the abuse. So I feel exactly the same way about my own church as I do about what's happened here with these British Pakistani Muslims towards, predominantly British Pakistani Muslims towards young girls. But this, I think you and I talked about this before, Gad. The woke ideology was definitely a contributing factor here. People did not want to put their head over the parapet because they were terrified of getting shot.
Britain and Europe have paid a heavy price for this mindset. Grooming scandals swept under the rug, no-go areas, terror attacks, and growing public anger. America is watching and should learn from it. Ideas have consequences. Pretending Islam is beyond criticism, while importing its problems at scale, isn't compassionate, it's reckless.
Exactly right. Look, cultural relativism is a pathogenic idea that I discuss in The Parasitic Mind, because it purports that who are we to judge the cultural practices, the religious practices of another culture? So if another culture wants to cut off the clitorises of 5-year-old girls, who are you to judge, you cultural imperialist? No, I am here to judge. There are absolutist, deontological, moral principles that any decent person should abide by. Cutting off the clitorises of little girls is never okay. And so you're exactly right that the coupling of these parasitic woke ideas with the reflex of suicidal empathy, put them together, you end up with a cocktail that leads us to the abyss of infinite lunacy.
Do you feel, notwithstanding that, the way that I feel, which is I do think
the West's strength has always been open debate and self-criticism. Treating one ideology as off-limits while demanding everyone else adapt is unsustainable. Piers' performance here was a textbook example of why so many people are losing trust in mainstream voices on this issue. We need more Gad Saads willing to speak clearly, and fewer Piers Morgans desperate to stay in the middle while reality burns around them. Do you think Piers was being reasonable, willfully difficult, or just dodging the hard questions? If you're tired of media figures protecting ideologies at the expense of truth, smash that like button, subscribe, and share. We need way more honest conversations like this.